small apology in the sense of I somehow managed to blank out the word live from the summons from Michael in terms of what's going to be talked about today. So I'll be having a little think during the earlier talk about what liveness might mean in terms of ethnomethodological research. And I guess I had a similar sort of problem in that I sort of thought, well, I don't quite know how that would work. In that one of the sort of the special licenses, I guess, for all those researchers and academics, is not to have to do things under the pressures of them being live and make sense of them in that way at the time. So the special license we have, whether we do ethnomethodological study or other sorts of social science studies, is to stop for a minute and reflect back on how people do the things that they do or what the things are they're doing. So the sort of idea of it being live seems sort of a puzzling thing to try and deal with as it's sort of coming at you. And in fact, the point of recording technologies is generally to sort of slow them down and make them unlive and be able to deal with them in those sorts of terms. So live found a bit of a puzzle. But then on the other hand, ethnomethodology has always been interested in what it calls lived work and people doing things under real-time conditions. And I think that's possibly why I sort of blanked out live somewhat and it focuses instead on the real-time aspects of what people do when they're doing things. And that was what I'm going to talk about in this talk, is film production and the sort of real-time aspects of editing a film together. And that's the material I'm going to talk through. And in talking through, what I'll do is just talk through one of the sort of cycles of editing that happen during film production. And it's reasonably short, it's 3 minutes, and so we'll look at that in real time. And along the way, what I'll try and do is also bring in a little bit about the idea of what that video is as a sort of as a playable medium. And that's one of the things that I've been interested in the project. Each of this sort of appears and is manipulated in real time. And the sort of inspiration for some of this work, and earlier work that was done by two researchers who grew from an ethnomethodological and conversation analytic background, Clayman and Reisner. They did some work in the late 90s on newspaper editing meetings, and what they looked at there was the editorial round that's done before the newspaper is produced. And they looked at meetings where basically the chief editor then sits down with his sub-editors of particular sections and gets them to basically go through a few preliminaries, and then he gets them to do story reviews for him. And he or she gets to sit and select from amongst those stories as to what will, for instance, on the front page, which will be at the top of particular section pages, and so on, and which stories don't get in at all. So run a study and set out these sort of routine features of the meeting. The stories are presented, reviewed, and then they're selected amongst. And this, indeed, is a reasonably similar routine part of the editing process that you see in film production. There are some preliminaries, but rather sort of story pitching and story review, what you have is a showing of an edited sequence of the film, which is then reviewed, and a series of proposals tends to emerge, rather than a chief editor getting to select one of those. And we'll see some of that happening here. And amongst those proposals of what film could be next, or how they're going to edit the film next, a particular one is selected to work on. So this sort of material, further project is very dark, so it might be a little bit hard to see. The projector isn't all that bright. But what I'll do is, the material is quite hard to present because it's quite complicated in the sense that it's a video recording of video activities. So I'll do a little bit of introductory work to sort of familiarise ourselves a bit with the setting. So first off, the two characters we're going to see.
So what do you actually want this second thing to do?
The person here is Nick. He's the editor. He's a BAFTA award-winning editor, and he'll be the one that we'll see working on the screen.
I mean,
and he works alongside Chris, the director, and they worked on a previous film documentary production. They've come together to make a new documentary, and this documentary is on some dangers of celebrity culture. And some of you may have seen it, we may have not. It was released about 2 years ago. It's called Star Suckers. And this is sort of within their editing suite is the visualization of the film. They call it the snake. So basically on the wall is this series of frame graphs which they've pasted up with sort of rough working structure of the overall film. And there's interesting ways in which they bring that in when they're trying to assemble the film, but we're not going to look at one of those. We're going to look at working on the screens. And so this one would be quite hard to see from the back. It's quite low resolution, but we're going to look at it in more detail. You'll see more of the details as I sort of blow up particular shots later. But just to sort of say a little bit about an editing interface for those of you who haven't seen it. So this is the main screen where they look at the film as it will appear later. And on the left-hand side here, you've got the editing timeline, where these sort of greyed out bits are little clips that are being assembled. And there's two interfaces above that, one of which sort of shows things on the timeline, and another one shows individual clips that you're working on. And so the sequence that they're working on, which they're about to start doing some changes to, is a sequence where they're going to leave a paparazzo who's been talking to them about capturing people outside clubs and so on, and what happens there. And they're going to move to a new scene of the film where a character called James, who's an expert on changing the news media, is going to sort of talk to camera about changes to news and the sort of the rise of people like Helen Mackenzie in the newspaper business.
I'm not attached to stores which are based entirely on local estate. I have got the iconic front page here, with a star based my hamster. Now that to me was the big. I can't see the those things. See what I see with those total shell. It's in the boxes. Right. So this is it, for example. Oh, that's it.
Jude.
That's quite nice. This is just a view.
Jude.
Or, no, it is useful there. Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing I worked in, it's a change like this. So I didn't have 3 copies of one, but yeah, that's good today. We were pretty fade to back since we're going out today. Yeah. Or leaving Saturday's van, on the shot. Could we go back to the quotes? Is that, just give extra emphasis, because then it's like an whole other set. We could go in, or we could do something on that, and just go back and just go in all the set. And then go to Jones. Instead, that's our. Just to give it some kind of. It's so dull visually. How's that being treated? That just look like a rack. Yeah.
There was a quote from somewhere, but I can't remember who knows what you know, maybe not the... Yeah.
No, I think scarcity cutting isn't as good as the second advice kept.
Yeah.
So, I think maybe phase back. Yeah, because we've just spent a lot of time with it, and he's given us some value, so... Yeah, I think
Or a shot. Another wide of his phone.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's the end of his story, isn't it?
Well, I think you're right. Yeah.
So that was it in real time, uninterrupted. I tried to keep it quite short, although it may seem quite long. As with Dave's material, on the biologists earlier, it's professionals at work, so quite what's going on is a bit hard to follow, especially if you've not seen what happens in editing suites before. It's sort of jumping back and forth in the film, replaying clips, so quite where you're at is hard to track. What I'll do is I'll try and break up and slow it down a bit so that we get a sense of what was going on there. And so we begin at the beginning with where they're reviewing the current edits they've done of that sequence. And as I said, one of the things that's really quite difficult in this material is that we have a set of video materials that they're working on, and then we're looking at the video of those video materials. So in a sense, we've got to keep track of two parallel sets of video action. One is that thing that they're looking at, and the second one is us looking at this recording of them, which does make this quite hard to follow, especially, of course, because the two are intimately interwoven. So let's go back right to the beginning and just play a tiny short bit. This is where we look at the first clip, which is ending the last sequence with the paparazzo, and then bringing up this new one of the expert on journalism and Chris, the director, walking up to a shed, opening the door, and Chris saying, "Blimey."
I'm not attached to stories which are based entirely on the look at the set. Remember what the iconic front page here, the star page my hamster. Now that to me was the big.
Can't see the newspapers. See what see with the newspapers share. Okay, see those boxes.
So this is where the director interrupts the editor's playback for the first time. As he says in the first frame there, as the still image of Freddie Starr, my hamster from the newspaper, comes up, he interrupts this with "Hey," and they stop. The editor stops the video at that point and tries to make sense of the comments made by the director. The director that has this sort of negative assessment of what you see, which you can't really see that they're newspapers, which is a bit puzzling given what's on screen in a minute. It's Freddie Starr ate my hamster. Freddie Starr ate my hamster. So see what are newspapers is the editor's query here. And so the director has provided a slightly more extended description of what he's after. See that there are newspapers in the shed. Having heard that, the editor then rewinds the footage, or takes the footage back to the clip he was talking about, which is going into the shed here, and begins to defend that clip. So he's saying, you can see lots of boxes, can you, in the shed? And we'll look at that section there as he starts to defend the shed shot.
See what see with the newspapers share. Okay, see those boxes. Yeah, so it's this bit, for example. Oh, a lip. I think it's quite nice.
Okay, so going back to this, so he plays back to clips, so you can see there's lots of boxes, can you? So trying to sort of instruct the director in re-looking at this clip and looking at it in terms of the fact that you can fancy there's lots of boxes. So a nice example of what you might call it instructed seeing. So they replay the clip to both have a look at it, to sort of secure access as well for both of them to that same clip. Because one of the characteristics of video, of course, is as soon as it stops playing, it disappears. You're reliant on the play of video to see the video. So it plays the video to re-establish what it was they were looking at. Director does this head waving. The editor provides an additional reason for the reasonableness of the shot. He says they're newspapers. So not only can you see the boxes, he also says newspaper. And the director has another sort of negative assessment to make of it. Yeah, sorry, this is just a bit muffled. So there's no only problem with not being able to see the boxes, but the sound is muffled. In response to that, the editor says, oh, it'll lift, which just brings in something of his professional competence there, because one of the things that editors know about is for sound correction to be done. And lifting the sound is one of those technical operations that an editor can do. Replace the section again to rehear and relook at it with that in mind, and then write his own positive assessment of that shot. The editor saying, I think it's quite nice. And one of the things that that we noticed in studying directors and editors is they do look at these unfinished assessments where they don't quite provide the formulation that would go at the end of that. And when the director and editor are in agreement, then what happens normally is the director will jump in to say, to finish that sentence for him, saying something like, I think it's quite a nice little intro, the director, for instance, would say. And that would show nicely that they're both in agreement about, we like the shot, we'll continue. But instead, he just gets an okay. Director. So the editors defended the clip to some extent from this initial negative response from the director. So he plays it again, so he's replaying the problem clip, and this allows for its reassessment in terms of, again, imagining how the audio might be improved, and again, allowing this equal access to the clip. So we'll just do that.
I think it's quite nice. This is just a view.
I like facts of stories which are based entirely on
I think it's nice.
So, replace the clip with Owen lift. Doug says, okay, I think it's quite nice, and he said the okay, and then as we continue there, on replaying it, he also talks over it to try and emphasize the other aspects that should be seen in the clip. So just a few newspapers and then it, and he's dramatizing what's coming up next in terms of the clip they're cutting to next. I think it'll be the few and then you get the many newspapers over the desk. So the sort of few to the many, emphasizing the sort of excitement over that cut between those two clips. And then there's a shift which prefigures the move in terms of their routine editorial cycle to something else. And he's now trying to make a proposal here. I think it'll be a really nice little intro. So it goes from being just reviewing it to him proposing it as something they might go with. And this is really just a shift onto that next stage of the editorial process. So they've reviewed, made some assessments, and now started to potentially make some proposals, around which what you would then do, or make your proposals, write them to account why this is a good way of going ahead with the film.
which are based entirely on
I think really nice. The change in music, or his musical then. Yeah. Just before. This is about that. Maybe then the cues just finish. Yeah, I think that's it.
So the editor now, in terms of sort of building up this proposal that he's made, he's not only done this shift from the few to the many, in terms of the shifting the clips, he then also takes him back to the previous scene and gets them to imagine the music that would go over the two transitions. So the music of Kevin Paparazzo ending, which will help mark one scene as being over. Just before hearing this phrase from Paparazzo, they make them up, don't they? And then he brings in the sequentiality of the film, the importance of thinking about the overall sequence of the film by gesturing towards, on the timeline there, gesturing towards the timeline. It's done as a proxy for the overall structure of the film. And the timeline is useful there because, like the image of the snake in the wall, it allows you to think about the longer and larger structure of the film, where again the problem with film is seeing the whole thing. And also, what they're giving music will give that emphasis. And he finishes, I think that'll work. Gets a yeah from the director, who then sort of starts moving back, change back. Sorry, I didn't copy his line, says the director. But if that's lifted, then, and so it starts to make it dependent on, if the sound can be fixed, then we may accept this as a reasonable proposal of a way of cutting the film together. The editor continues to elaborate. I mean, we could even fade black, we're going night to day. The director says, yeah, you know. Still, I guess you might be noticing not some sort of great enthusiasm from the director yet. And as the editor continues to elaborate on and support those, the campus goes a week in there, have a shot, so actually bring in further proposals. It's at this point the director finally says, can we go back to the quotes? There's something else he wants to look at.
Or leave him sat in his van, having a shot. Could we go back to the quotes? Is that just give it extra emphasis, because then it's like an onlooker said. We just go in, or we could do something not now, but just go back and just go in instead, and then go to James. Instead, that's our just to give it some kind of.
So he's listened to the editor's proposals, some of which we're proliferating a little bit towards the end. The account of Wentworth's proposals, he interrupts those with his alternative proposal. Can we go back to the quotes? And so, interesting phrase in this is it sort of, could we go back to the quotes being a proposal as an alternative proposal, but also heard anyway by the editor as bring up the quotes so we can have a look at those again. And he then says, just to give it extra emphasis. So he's thinking the quotes might be a way of leaving and shifting from one scene to another rather than going to the sheds full of newspapers. So the editor brings the newspaper clip up, because then it's like an onlooker said, where an onlooker said is actually written in the text there, and you get this lovely bit of gestural work that the director does over the screen to sort of start animating what at the minute is just a fixed piece of text. So just go in, or we could do something not now, but just go back in, so we can zoom in and out on this fixed bit of newspaper text to emphasize the quote he's interested in. An onlooker said, and then he does this, if you remember, but the director does this very nice gesture like that, and in close timing with that, the editor actually shifts the material on the screen for him. It's a lovely piece of synchronized work around the screen. And then finish thing with just to give it some kind of emphasis. So let's look at the editor bringing back up the newspaper clip.
Just to give it some kind of it's so dull visually. How is that going to be treated?
It just looked like a back and forth.
Yeah.
And so one of the editor's skills there is very quickly jumps to bring up these clips from another part of the film and drop them in where the director wants them, with that sound in the background, to allow them again to sort of inspect what that would look like. Where again, the problematic nature of the medium of video and film is to get it moving, play it to see what the thing might look like, and to make assessments about it. And indeed, the assessment he provides on bringing up the newspaper clip, this classic from editors is just so dull, where one of the roles the editor has in terms of film production is to monitor sort of image quality and things like, in this case, the dullness of the image. So he provides that assessment, and then starts to sort of talk about visually how's that going to be treated. We're treated at the beginning on this professionally meaningful terms of they can bring in someone from graphics or animation here to try and do something a bit more interesting to it, to try and make it less dull. And then what's very interesting in terms of the work of playing the media is, so they've, up until this point, if we remember what they've done, they've looked at the sequence, which was sort of interrupted, then they played out certain little sections to make them available so they can assess those, decide whether they're any good or not, and then also played some certain little sections to start proposing potential things the film might look like as they re-edit it. And what now happens is the editor, without saying anything else, just starts to play through the entire transition.
There's a quote from somewhere, very much jump on who knows when you're nothing.
No, I think the Kevin thing isn't as good as saying goodbye to Kevin.
And so one of the nice things that gets done in this started to do an extended playback because it makes a decision by the director relevant. It's basically a way of the editor pushing the director on that to make a decision. By sort of playing, we're going to play the whole sequence, look at it, and make a decision around it, securing it by playing through the medium. And as it's getting played through, you have this interruption from the director, this no, a negation of the previous proposal, repairing, removing that previous proposal, and then starting to sort of verbalize a lot of what he's thinking here. Oh, I think to go through cutting isn't as good as saying goodbye to Kev, so say goodbye to Kev with Paparazzo, don't use his cutting proposal, and then I think maybe fade to black, which is sort of agreement from the editor, because we've just spent a lot of time with him and he's given us good value, so yeah, I think fade to black, and then the editor starts to make one of his alternative proposals, which you were shaking up earlier, or a shot, another wide span, absolutely, says the director, and starts to head back off, possibly to Facebook or his email. Absolutely, yep. And that's the end of the story, isn't it? Yeah, I really don't think it's coming back from here. It's fine, don't know. Yeah. So off he goes. So that was it. That was one whole little sequence. Slowed down, taken out of real time for us, but tried to deal with the real timeness of the original participants. So one of the things that I've been interested in thinking about is how the work that's done with the video in terms of playing short sections, rewinding, jumping from section to section, gesturing over it, does the work of editing together. So there you have that last little bit at the end with the playthrough, which was to try and push the editors to make a decision about what they were going to do next. Doing a replay when they've provided an assessment of a shot, so look at it again to reassess it in the light of looking at it there, because you can't see it otherwise. Unlike, say, a photograph or a painting, where it's always there, you look at it, make assessments possibly by gesturing over certain areas of drawing attention to those, but not always having it there in this video. And then the editor's work, for instance, sort of rewinding to earlier in the sequence to sort of make relevant what came before their current clip, to think about whether what they're working on as an opening scene is a sort of relevant way to work, or a relevant place to work on next, or a relevant clip to have next within the structure of the film. So, it's only 3 minutes. But it takes quite a long time to work through that sort of real-timeness, and I guess that's part of the ethno lesson here, or the conversation analysis lesson here, is taking these small sections of real-time material and trying to make sense of them and work through them actually takes a considerable length of time, and of course considerably longer in terms of the transcription work, sitting down and looking at this very closely as a project, or student members of the project looking at this closely and trying to think about what's going on. All that takes an incredibly large amount of time for a small bit of 3 minutes of real time. And I guess there's strange elements to this in the sense of it's only 3 minutes out of what's a 9-month editing cycle, so it's also only a tiny fraction of that. And yet one of the things I think that makes it a relevant piece of real time to work on is the fact that it is a routine feature of the editing work. They do these little editorial rounds a lot. There's other things that go on, but they certainly do these a lot. So it's a recurrent feature, nevertheless, that you can look at. And so I guess it's justified to look at it in that sense. I guess that's about all I want to say in terms of the material. I'm having questions at the end. So, thank you.